Hello. I'm going to talk about the Sport Parkour League and my experience with them as a transgender athlete. I would like to preface this by saying I think the people in charge of SPL are great people, and I don't want this to come off as me being angry at them, but I'd rather it start a discussion so going forward we can create a future for trans athletes in the Sport Parkour League and parkour in general. Before I even considered competing, I reached out to a number of female athletes who have competed in the Sport Parkour League or who plan to compete in the Sport Parkour League, and all of them were on my side. All of them wanted me to be able to compete alongside them. There was one athlete who was skeptical at first, but then we had a very long conversation about my point of view and what I experienced and pretty much what I tried to explain in this video, and she seemed to come around and be on my side towards the end of it. So I will start at the Eastern Parkour Championships, the EPC. Before this competition, I was told that I would be able to compete in the women's style category, and we had talked about going forward if I were to qualify, me being able to compete in the NAPC, which is the North American Parkour Championship. We talked about two things: the idea of me competing but not being able to podium, and I thought that was a little bit upsetting, but I was going to entertain the thought for the first year just to prove that I'm not in this to just win. I want to just be able to compete. I want it to be fair, and I want to be included. And the other scenario was the ideal scenario of full inclusion. I'm able to compete if I qualify, and I have full podium capabilities if I do well. Then I competed in the EPC. I won women's style, which means technically that I qualified for the NAPC. Then I had a meeting with a rep from SPL, and he straight up told me they decided I am not allowed to compete at all. And the thing that upset me the most was the unclear answers that I got. They just kind of shifted around, and I can't really blame who I talked to because they kept saying they're just a messenger. So maybe they're higher up, there was a more clear answer, but I'm going to tell you what I was told. The first thing that I was told was that because the women's division is a lot smaller than the men's division, it would deter other athletes from competing. But in all honesty, I think that reason is whack. Because if you look at any other sport, look at gymnastics, if Simone Biles is competing, then that should deter everyone else from competing because she's going to win. You know, that's just not how it works. People are going to compete. People are going to have fun competing. People are going to want to compete against me. Also, that's implying that I'm even going to do well, which I very well could just compete and do terrible. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. The second thing that I was told is the most classic argument about trans athletes competing, and it was that I would have an unfair advantage. Now, as far as advantages go, for me, I do have some. And those advantages are I work at a gymnastics gym and have a key to that gymnastics gym, so I have access to training whenever I want, and I train very often after classes or on the weekends or really whenever I want. The gym has a foam pit, the gym has mats, a bunch of blocks that I can make different setups, and that is an advantage because not everyone has access to stuff like that. Another advantage could also be that most of my friends are way better than I am, so they're constantly pushing me and motivating me to do more things, and they can always give me tips for things that they already know how to do. And maybe that's an advantage too. But you know what's not an advantage? Me being assigned male at birth. And this is going to lead to their third point, but I can tell you from my own experience and from a bunch of articles that I linked down below that after being 2 years on hormone replacement therapy, which for me is testosterone blockers, estrogen, and progesterone pills, that it has seriously decreased my muscle mass. And if you want to do your own research, if you don't believe me, I promise you will find the same exact thing. I promise if you click the right link down there, it will say the same exact thing if it's about the effects of hormones. But if you look up the effects of estrogen and testosterone blockers, it decreases muscle mass significantly. I lost almost 10 pounds, or probably about exactly 10 pounds of muscle mass after throughout the years of transitioning. And that was while I was still training. But like I said, this leads to the third thing they said, which is they don't really know how much hormones or hormone replacement therapy would do. They don't know if that's enough to make it so I am able to compete, or to say that I don't have an unfair advantage, which is coming from a place of ignorance, not like hateful ignorance, but just like genuinely not knowing, which I can kind of understand, but resources are available to learn, and I told him what I know about hormone replacement therapy. And if they did any research at all on trans athletes, they would know that there are no, none of them have advantages. Now, some argument that I wanted to point out before I go to the last thing that they told me, which is what is going on with trans athletes in the Olympics and, rulings in the IOC. Now, trans athletes have been able to compete since 2003, and since 2003, even though they made their rules less strict about trans athletes competing in 2016, no trans woman has ever qualified for the Olympics. Everyone is so scared of trans women competing in sports and then taking over and just being total dominance of trans women, but that hasn't happened. The only time we ever talk about trans athletes is when they win, and it's that one time they win over the 47 other times they lost. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is trans women are allowed to be good at something. We are allowed to work really hard towards something, and we're allowed to get good at it. And we're allowed to feel great about our own ability, and we should be allowed to compete if we want for what we trained for. I'll use Fallon Fox as an example. She was a UFC fighter, a trans woman UFC fighter. She won her first couple fights, and there was huge amount of outrage and people freaking out, saying she had all these advantages. But then she lost a fight, and no one talked about it. No one talked about how she had a fight against a cisgender woman. The cisgender woman beat Fallon Fox, and I didn't hear one thing about it. Another example would be a trans cyclist named Rachel MacKinnon. In one of the articles that I linked down below, the Athlete Ally article, she was the first transgender woman to ever win a major cycling tournament. And after she won, the person who came in third caused a huge deal about it and started talking about how it's unfair. But then Rachel points out that she has raced the same person 13 times. And 11 of those 13 times, Rachel was beat by this girl. So it was only that one time where Rachel actually won, where people began to freak out and talk about unfair advantages. But when she was losing, there was no unfair advantages. And now the last thing that I was told was the only one that I could kind of understand, and it was that they just genuinely don't know how to go about making a policy. And going forward, I would love to help out and create a policy and reach out to other trans athletes who can also help out with that, because I'm sure it's a lot of work. And they talked about how they wouldn't know how to handle the backlash if someone asked, why does she get to compete? What would we say? That's what they told me. But if we create a policy for trans inclusion in the Sport Parkour League, then all you have to say is, why does she get to compete? Because she's a woman and she can compete. And that's all you really got to tell them. You don't have to tell them. You could even tell them to look at our policy once it's made. But going forward, I would love to help out with that. I would love to make that happen so that in NAPC 8, I think, I'm able to compete if I qualify. NAPC 7 was last weekend, and I watched the whole thing, and every time I saw the women's style event, I was super excited to watch them. They all did super amazing, but I felt this strong feeling of being left out. And it's not like I didn't qualify for it. I was just told I'm not allowed to compete. I wanted to be there. I wanted to compete with them. I wanted to support them in all of their lines and their tricks, and I thought it would have been super cool to hang out and train with them and just be present. So I guess that one is for sure more emotional and more of just why I'm upset. But everything else, I think I stated decently okay facts. And if you don't believe what I say, or you think I'm not saying enough, which is fair, like I said, I linked a ton of stuff down here. It's videos of trans athletes, different news articles of trans athletes, the effects of hormones for trans people, and I genuinely want you to read that before you say something negative to me. Don't just watch me and then say I can't compete or don't think I could compete without doing any research, because that's where all this debate comes from. It's the ignorance and people genuinely not knowing about trans athletes. Okay, and this is the last thing. I also linked the NCAA rulebook on transgender athletes, and I'll try and find the IOC, policy for transgender athletes and link that too. But if these giant organizations like the IOC and NCAA are including trans people, you don't think there'd be, extensive research on whether it's fair or not? Okay, bye!